They were mocked before they even took off. In German mess halls, pilots laughed at the idea, black American aviators flying P-51 Mustangs, protecting bombers over Europe? Impossible, they said. But soon, those same German pilots would curse the name Red Tails. The Tuskegee Airmen, once dismissed as an experiment, would carve their legend across the skies of World War II. They would protect bombers when no one else could. And in less than a year, they would rack up more than 100 kills, against some of the Luftwaffe's best. This is the story of how mockery turned into respect, and how a group of men who were never supposed to fight became one of the most feared squadrons in the European war. Before they ever faced the enemy, they had to prove they belonged in the cockpit. In 1941, the very idea of a black man flying a military aircraft was a controversy. America was at war with fascism abroad, yet segregation ruled at home. Many white officers and politicians argued that African Americans lacked the intelligence, coordination, and courage to handle a fighter plane. It wasn't just prejudice, it was policy. The military was built on it. But pressure was mounting. Civil rights groups, black newspapers, and a handful of determined politicians demanded that the U.S. government give African Americans the chance to serve as pilots. The Roosevelt administration, wary of criticism and desperate for manpower, finally agreed, though not without conditions. If it were to happen, it would be separate. An experiment. A test to see if colored men could really fly. The location chosen was Tuskegee, Alabama, a place known more for cotton fields than airplanes. The Army Air Corps built a segregated training base near the Tuskegee Institute, a historically black college that had trained engineers, scientists, and teachers long before the government believed it possible. The airfield was new, the equipment old, and the expectations almost non-existent. Some in Washington even whispered that the program was designed to fail. But the men who arrived there had other plans. They came from Harlem, Chicago, Texas, and small towns across the country. Some were college graduates, others had learned to fly in civilian clubs. All had heard the same laughter, the same doubt. They wore hand-me-down uniforms and trained on second-hand planes, yet they carried themselves with an unshakable pride. In the summer heat, they lined up on the airfield, their faces glistening with sweat and resolve. Among them was a tall, composed cadet named Benjamin O. Davis Jr., the son of the Army's first black general. He was quiet, disciplined, and carried himself like a man who had already accepted the weight of history. Another was Lee Archer, sharp-eyed and fearless, who had dreamed of flying since boyhood. Each man knew that every takeoff and landing would be judged not just as an individual act, but as a verdict on an entire race. The instructors, mostly white officers, didn't make it easy. Some treated the cadets with open contempt. A few refused to speak to them except through written notes. If one of you fails, one instructor said coldly, you all fail. The message was clear, there would be no excuses, no second chances. So they worked harder. They memorized flight manuals by candlelight. They practiced emergency procedures until their hands moved faster than thought. The roar of engines became their rhythm, the smell of fuel and sweat their constant companion. Every maneuver had to be perfect, every roll, every climb, every dive. The early training planes were fragile, PT-17 Stearmans with rattling frames and engines that coughed like old men. But in those flimsy biplanes, the cadets learned precision and patience. Later, they graduated to At-6 Texans, sleek, faster, and far less forgiving. By then, they had become something remarkable, professional aviators in a world that refused to acknowledge them as equals. Accidents were common. Crashes happened. The men would gather silently as the wreckage was pulled from the field, each loss a gut punch, each death a reminder that failure wasn't just personal, it was political. The newspapers were watching. The White House was watching. Every success had to shout louder than every doubt. Weeks turned into months, and the air above Tuskegee filled with the sound of progress. One by one, the cadets mastered formation flying, aerial gunnery, and navigation. They began to believe, truly, that they could take this skill beyond Alabama, to the war itself. But belief wasn't enough. They needed wings. When graduation day finally came in 1943, the airfield was packed. Families and reporters gathered under the glaring sun as the first class of black military pilots received their silver wings. There were no marching bands, no grand speeches from generals, just the sound of applause and the quiet pride of men who had done what the country said they couldn't. The U.S. Army officially activated the 99th Fighter Squadron, the first all-black combat unit in history. They would fly P-40 Warhawks, tough and reliable but already outdated compared to the German and Italian fighters they'd soon face. Their mission would take them to North Africa, then Italy, where the skies themselves would decide their worth. Before they left, the mechanics at Tuskegee painted a bright red stripe on the tail of each aircraft. It started as a simple way to identify their planes in the air. But to the men, it meant something more. It was a signature. A statement. When the bombers looked back and saw those red tails behind them, they would know exactly who had their backs. The journey from Alabama's dusty fields to Europe's war-torn skies was more than a transfer, it was a transformation. The men who had been called an experiment were now soldiers. They were no longer asking for permission to belong. They were ready to prove it in the only way that mattered, in combat, under fire, in the thin air between life and death. When the red tails arrived in North Africa, the war had already swallowed entire continents. The desert heat was suffocating, the runways little more than dust and grit, and the pilots were still carrying the weight of doubt that had followed them from Alabama. They had trained for years to reach this point, but now, for the first time, they were face to face with the enemy. Their orders were simple on paper: escort bombers, protect Allied ships, and engage if attacked. In practice, it meant life or death against an enemy that had ruled the skies for years. The Luftwaffe's pilots were experienced, their Focke-Wulf 190s and Messerschmitt 109s faster and deadlier than the P-40s the Tuskegee men flew. The Germans had nicknames for every Allied squadron they faced, except these new arrivals. To them, the 99th Fighter Squadron was just a rumor. The first missions were reconnaissance flights, long stretches of silence punctuated by bursts of static. The young pilots scanned the horizon, sweat soaking their gloves, fingers twitching over triggers. The desert blurred beneath them, endless and cruel. They flew low over enemy positions, dodging flak that burst in black blossoms around them. At night, they returned to base with their planes riddled but their spirits intact. The first real encounter came over Pantelleria, a small island fortress between Tunisia and Sicily. German fighters appeared suddenly, cutting through the sun glare, diving straight into the formation. The red tails broke formation to intercept. Lieutenant Charles Hall, a calm and methodical pilot from Oklahoma, locked onto a Focke-Wulf and fired. The enemy plane burst into flames and spiraled into the sea. When Hall landed back at base, his comrades lifted him onto their shoulders. It was the first confirmed aerial victory by a black American pilot. For a brief moment, it felt like vindication, proof that they belonged. But back in Washington, the headlines were muted. Reports from their missions were delayed or buried in paperwork. Some senior officers accused the unit of poor performance, even suggesting they were unfit for combat. The 99th was temporarily pulled from operations and ordered to stand down. It felt like betrayal. Benjamin O. Davis Jr., now commanding the squadron, was summoned to Washington to answer the criticism in person. He stood before a panel of skeptical generals who questioned everything from his tactics to his pilot's courage. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't flinch. Instead, he recited statistics: sorties flown, targets hit, ships protected, and not one bomber lost under their watch. The silence that followed said everything. The 99th would be reinstated. When they returned to duty, the men were different. Their pride had hardened into purpose. They flew as if they had something to prove every single day, not just to the enemy, but to their own country. In early 1944, they were assigned new aircraft, the sleek, silver P-51 Mustang. It was faster, tougher, and could fly higher than anything they had flown before. The pilots quickly made it their own. They painted the tails deep red, brighter, bolder, impossible to miss. It was the beginning of a legend. Their first bomber escort mission took them over Italy. The air was alive with tension. Below them, endless formations of B-17s droned toward their targets. Above, contrails twisted and merged in the thin air. The red tails stayed close, weaving patterns in the sky like a living shield. They didn't chase every enemy fighter they saw, they stayed disciplined, holding the line even as German planes baited them with feigned retreats. The bomber crews noticed. At first, they had been uneasy about being protected by an all-black squadron. Some had even requested other escorts. But after that day, those same crews radioed in a different message: "We want the red tails with us." Word spread fast. The red tails flew higher, farther, and faster than ever. Their missions took them deep into German territory, through flak storms so dense it felt like flying through rain. They faced ambushes, mechanical failures, exhaustion, and fear, but not failure. On one mission over Austria, Lee Archer spotted two Messerschmitts diving toward the bombers. Without hesitation, he banked his Mustang into a steep climb, cutting through their formation. He fired once, twice, two German planes went down in flames. A third tried to escape. Archer chased it for miles before firing the final burst. 3 kills in a single sortie. When he returned to base, his aircraft was smoking and his oxygen system damaged, but he was alive. Every victory came at a cost. Some never returned. Their planes vanished into clouds or went down in fireballs miles from home. Each loss hit the squadron like a gut punch, but it only strengthened their resolve. They began painting small symbols under their cockpits, not for glory, but to remember the men who didn't make it back. By mid-1944, the name Red Tails carried weight. German pilots began recognizing them by their color alone. Over the radio, they taunted them in broken English. "You fly for America," one German sneered during combat. "America doesn't fly for you." The response came swift and cold, drowned out by gunfire. Minutes later, the German planes spiraled downward, trailing smoke. Each battle pushed them closer to mastery. The skies above Europe had become their arena, their proving ground. They weren't just escorting bombers anymore, they were rewriting what it meant to be American airmen. By early 1945, the Red Tails had become a legend whispered through the bomber ranks and cursed in German briefings. They were no longer an experiment, no longer a question of if they could. They were now the pilots you prayed were flying above you when flak filled the sky. But as their reputation grew, so did the danger. The Luftwaffe was desperate, throwing its last weapons into the air. And among them was something the Allies had never faced before: the world's first operational jet fighter. The Messerschmitt Me-262. Sleek, twin engines mounted under swept wings, its speed was unmatched. When it appeared, it looked like a machine from the future, silver-gray, impossibly fast, roaring past propeller-driven fighters like they were standing still. To the bomber crews, it was a ghost, 1 second distant, the next streaking past in a flash of light and smoke. The Allies called it the Stormbird. The Red Tails called it a challenge. In late March, orders came down: the 332nd Fighter Group would escort bombers deep into Germany for one of the war's final large-scale missions, the Berlin Raid. Intelligence warned that Me-262s might be waiting. The Red Tails didn't flinch. At dawn, 43 P-51 Mustangs lined up on a muddy Italian runway. Engines roared to life, propellers spinning into a blur. The Red Tails gleamed in the rising sun, bright as fresh blood against silver wings. One by one, they lifted into the sky. Over the Alps, the temperature dropped so low the cockpits frosted from the inside. Ice crackled along the canopy edges. Below, the landscape shifted from snow to smoke, the heart of a dying empire. The bombers droned ahead, massive and slow, carrying the weight of a war's ending. Their safety depended on the red tails, and the red tails knew it. Then, somewhere above Berlin, the warning came through the radio. Bandits at 12 o'clock, high altitude, fast movers. The voices were calm, but everyone knew what that meant. The jets had arrived. They appeared as streaks of light, for Me-262s diving from 30,000 feet, engines howling like thunder. Their speed was unreal. The first pass tore through the bomber formation, cannon fire ripping holes through wings and fuselages. Flames bloomed in the air as one B-17 spiraled down. Major Charles McGee, leading the escort, barked orders. Stay with the bombers. 2 sections break off, intercept. He knew they couldn't outpace the jets, but they could outthink them. The Me-262s had to slow down to turn, and that was where the red tails would strike. Captain Roscoe Brown spotted one jet banking too sharply after its attack run. He dove, throttle full forward, the Mustang shuddering from the strain. The Me-262 tried to pull away, engines screaming. Brown's sights aligned for a split second, he fired. Tracers stitched across the sky. The jet erupted into flame, pieces scattering like sparks from a forge. His voice crackled over the radio, calm but electrified, splash one jet. Nearby, Charles Brantley and Edward Toppins engaged the remaining Me-262s. The air was chaos, smoke, sunlight, and the deafening rattle of machine guns. The jets made another pass, but this time the red tails were ready. They cut across their path, forcing the Me-262s into defensive maneuvers. One German pilot dove too low, trying to escape. A red-tailed Mustang followed, guns blazing. The jet slammed into the forest below. By the time the bombers reached their targets and turned home, the sky was littered with debris. The radio crackled with quiet triumph. The red tails had destroyed 3 of Germany's most advanced fighters, and lost none of their own. The impossible had been done. But it wasn't just the technology that made those fights unforgettable, it was the contrast of worlds. The Me-262 represented the future of aviation, all speed and innovation, but flown by a regime crumbling under its own weight. The red tails represented something even newer, an America that hadn't fully accepted them, yet depended on their skill to win the war. In that sky, above the ruins of Berlin, the past and the future collided in flame and metal. In the weeks that followed, the missions continued. Each one felt heavier, more final. The Germans were fighting with what little they had left, and every sortie took the red tails deeper into enemy territory. They strafed trains, intercepted fighters, and guarded the bombers until the very last weeks of the war. On one of those final missions, Lee Archer spotted a Me-109 diving out of the sun. He rolled hard left, caught it in his sights, and fired. The German plane disintegrated midair. It was his 5th confirmed kill, the mark of an ace. Yet Archer didn't celebrate. He simply leveled his wings, scanned the horizon, and resumed formation. When the red tails returned to base, their planes showed the scars of battle, bullet holes patched with tape, paint scorched by fire. But their reputation was untouchable. The German radio frequencies carried new orders: do not engage the red-tailed Mustangs unless necessary. The same pilots who had once mocked them now warned others to stay away. The bomber crews called them angels. They were the ones who never broke formation, the ones who never abandoned them, no matter how thick the flak or how fierce the enemy fire became. For the men inside those lumbering bombers, the sight of crimson-painted tails in the distance was more than reassurance, it was a promise. If the red tails were up there, they had a chance to make it home. By 1944, the missions had grown longer, the stakes higher. The red tails flew hundreds of miles from their bases in Italy into the heart of Germany, over mountains, rivers, and cities that glowed red from fires below. The air up there was thin and freezing, but inside the cockpit it was hotter than hell. The oxygen masks rubbed their faces raw. Their gloved hands were cramped around the controls. Each hour in the air felt like a test of endurance as much as courage. They flew tight around the bombers, weaving patterns of protection. The command was simple: stay with the formation. While other squadrons broke off to chase kills, the Red Tails didn't flinch. They understood that protecting lives meant more than collecting victories. They didn't fly for glory, they flew for duty. Word of their discipline spread fast. American bomber crews who had once doubted them now begged for them over the radio. "Give us the Red Tails," they'd say before every mission. It wasn't just respect, it was faith. And faith, in war, is rarer than ammunition. But the skies were merciless. Every mission was a gamble with death. The German anti-aircraft guns sent black puffs of flak into the air, shards of steel that tore through wings and flesh. The pilots could smell the smoke from explosions even inside their oxygen masks. Sometimes, they watched helplessly as bombers ahead of them erupted into fireballs. There was no time to grieve, no time to slow down. You flew, or you died. In between missions, the airfields buzzed with quiet tension. The Tuskegee Airmen lived in tents near their planes, sleeping on cots, writing letters home, sharing stories over cold rations. They were still soldiers in a segregated army. The dining halls, the restrooms, the officers' clubs, all separate. Some of the white soldiers who shared their bases refused to salute them, refused even to speak. It didn't matter. The next day, those same men would owe their lives to the Red Tails in the air. When they climbed into their Mustangs, the world below ceased to exist. Up there, above the clouds, the color of skin didn't matter, only the color of the tail. The Red Tails gleamed like blood in the sun. The Luftwaffe knew that color now. It was a warning. The Schwarzvogelmänner, they called them, the Black Birdmen. The nickname had started as mockery. It ended in fear. Over time, the Red Tails began to develop their own rhythm in combat, a kind of dance in the sky. The lead pilots would draw enemy fighters away while the others closed in from behind. They trusted each other completely, each movement precise, each maneuver instinctive. Years later, pilots would say that flying with the Red Tails was like moving as one body, no hesitation, no confusion, just purpose. One afternoon, over southern Germany, a formation of B-24 bombers came under heavy attack. A swarm of Messerschmitts dove from the clouds, cutting through the formation. The Red Tails responded instantly. Captain Roscoe Brown took his Mustang into a near-vertical climb, then flipped over into a dive, tracing a perfect arc through the sky. He locked onto an enemy fighter tailing a bomber and fired. The German plane exploded midair, a burst of light and metal fragments scattering like fireworks. Without breaking formation, Brown radioed, "One less." Below him, another Mustang was hit. Smoke poured from the engine. The pilot's voice came over the radio, steady, but strained. "I'm hit. Losing altitude." Without hesitation, 2 Red Tails broke off and followed him down, ignoring orders to stay high. They circled his crash site until they saw his parachute open, until they were sure he was alive. Then they climbed back toward the formation, silent and focused, ready for the next fight. Acts like that became their signature. They didn't just protect bombers, they protected each other. The bond between the pilots ran deeper than rank or duty. They called each other brother, not as a slogan, but as survival. In the air, one man's life depended on another's reaction, another's instinct, another's courage. Every mission ended the same way, the long flight home. The sun would be setting by the time they reached their base in Italy, the Red Tails glowing against the horizon. As they landed, mechanics would rush forward, counting bullet holes and patching wings. Sometimes, a plane came back empty, its pilot lost to the clouds. The silence that followed was heavier than any ceremony. In the evenings, they gathered in the mess tent, talking quietly over tin cups of coffee. The air still smelled of fuel and sweat. Sometimes they laughed, at bad food, at broken radios, at the absurdity of being young and mortal in a world gone mad. Other times, they just sat, listening to the faint hum of engines still echoing in their ears. Above them, the sky stretched wide and dark. Tomorrow, they would rise again, back into the thin air where courage met fear, where men became more than what history had allowed them to be. Europe was falling silent. Hitler was dead, the German armies collapsing, and the Allied airfields that had once shaken with engines now hummed only with the wind. For the Red Tails, the final missions had already been flown. Some of the men were still young enough to feel immortal, but the war had aged them all. They had lived years inside moments, moments of terror, of triumph, of loss. Now, for the first time, there was stillness. They began packing up the tents, the maps, the radio gear. Mechanics wiped the grime from their hands and stared at the empty runways. The men had grown used to motion, to purpose, and now the waiting felt strange. When the order finally came to return home, they stood quietly, watching their Mustangs one last time. The red paint on the tails was chipped and faded, but it still gleamed faintly in the morning light, a reminder of everything they had survived. The voyage back across the Atlantic was long and uncertain. They crowded onto transport ships, staring out over gray water. Some thought of home, of families they hadn't seen in years, of the girls they had written to, of the cities they had left behind. Others thought of those who wouldn't be coming back. The ocean carried both silence and memory. When they stepped off the ships, there were no parades waiting. No bands, no banners. The country that had doubted them before the war didn't quite know what to do with them afterward. Some train stations refused to serve them food. Bus drivers told them to sit in the back in uniform. It was as if the heroism that had filled the skies had evaporated before touching the ground. Yet even as America looked away, the story of the Red Tails began to travel. Word of their record, the bomber crews they'd saved, the missions they'd completed, spread through airbases, newsrooms, and living rooms. The war had been full of heroes, but none like them. They had faced two enemies, one in the sky, and one in the mirror of their own nation, and they had beaten them both. Some stayed in the service. Benjamin O. Davis Jr. refused to fade into history. He became the first black general in the U.S. Air Force, commanding with the same calm precision he had shown at Tuskegee. Others, like Lee Archer and Charles McGee, continued to fly, teaching new generations of pilots who would grow up in a different world, a world their courage had made possible. The planes themselves were retired, lined up and stripped for parts, their red tails slowly fading under layers of dust. But to the men who had flown them, each bolt and rivet still hummed with life. They had left pieces of themselves in those cockpits, fear, sweat, laughter, and prayers whispered into oxygen masks somewhere above the clouds. In Washington, policymakers began to talk about what these men had proven. The walls of segregation inside the military, so long defended by custom and ignorance, were starting to crack. President Truman, reading reports of their service, signed Executive Order 9981 in 1948, ending segregation in the armed forces. It didn't erase the past, but it opened a door that had been locked for generations. For the Tuskegee men, that victory was quieter, more personal. It came in the form of a letter from a bomber crewman who had once doubted them. "You saved our lives," it read. "When we saw those red tails behind us, we knew we were safe." The letter was passed around the barracks, read aloud, and folded carefully away like a medal. Years later, when airshows returned to the skies, a few of the old pilots came back. Their hair was gray now, their uniforms snug across their shoulders. They stood beside restored Mustangs painted just as they had been, red tails shining under the summer sun. Crowds gathered to shake their hands, to thank them. Some of their former enemies, now elderly German pilots, came forward too. They spoke not as adversaries, but as men who had once shared the same thin air between life and death. There was no bitterness left, only recognition. In classrooms across America, children learned about the Tuskegee Airmen not as an experiment, but as pioneers. In films and museums, the roar of their engines was recreated so new generations could feel what it meant to fight for dignity at 25,000 feet. A new squadron of U.S. Air Force jets would one day bear red tails in their honor, their lineage carried forward in speed and steel. Still, for those who had lived it, the memories never lost their weight. Some nights, the dreams came back, the whine of engines, the rattle of gunfire, the smell of burning fuel. But mingled with those dreams was something gentler, the sound of laughter on the airfield, of radio banter before dawn, of the wind rushing past the canopy when they broke through the clouds.